We're going to think about some philosophy of logic, and we're going to do this with the help of William Stanley Jevons' book, Elementary Lessons in Logic, Deductive and Inductive. So I am the amateur logician from amateurlogician.com, and one of my missions is to help others master logic, especially traditional logic. This used to be a fundamental part of a classical liberal education, which sadly no longer exists, pretty much. And we really do need to rectify that. Now in this video, we're going to look at lesson 2 or chapter 2 and then work through the exercises in the back of the book. And it's going to be a springboard to think more philosophically about one aspect of logic. So we're going to go a little bit beyond what this book offers, but I want to use this as the, so to speak, genesis to start. In a previous video, we took a look at what this book has to offer, and right now we're going to go in a little bit more depth. And we're going to take a look at lesson 2, which is on the 3 parts of logical doctrine. I'm going to read just a little bit of this. It has been explained in the previous lesson that logic is a science of reasoning, or the science of those necessary laws of thought which must be observed if we are to argue consistently with ourselves and avoid self-contradiction. Argument or reasoning, therefore, is the strictly proper subject before us. But the most convenient and usual mode of studying logic is to consider first the component parts of which any argument must be made of. Just as an architect must be acquainted with the materials of a building or a mechanic with the materials of a machine before he can pretend to be acquainted with its construction, so the materials and instruments with which we must operate in reasoning are suitably described before we proceed to the actual forms of argument. So here he gives a basic overview. Let me turn the page. He gets into what is an argument? What is a syllogism? What is a syllogism composed of? Then he talks about the relationship logic has to language. Next, William Stanley Jevons goes into the so-called 3 acts of the mind, namely simple apprehension, judgment, and reasoning, and he defines these 3 acts. He also talks about the general notion. When we're talking about terms in logic, do we take or should we take a nominalist perspective, a realist perspective, or a conceptualist perspective? And this is actually going to be a springboard to a more philosophical discussion a little bit later. So he also gets into what he calls a 4th aspect of logic, which is, so to speak, after simple apprehension, judgment, and reasoning, and that is method. I'm going to flip back to the end of the book to look at lesson 2 exercises. So lesson 2, again, is on the 3 parts of logic. So we're going to name the parts of which a syllogism is composed. How far is it correct to say that logic is concerned with language? What are the 3 acts of mind considered in logic? Which of them is more especially the subject of the science? Can you state exactly what is meant by a general notion, idea, or conception? How do the nominalist, realist, and conceptualists differ in their opinions as to the nature of a general notion? What is the supposed 4th part of logic? So let's look into those. The first question that Jevons asks us is to name the parts of a categorical syllogism. So a categorical syllogism will have 3 propositions in it. 2 of them will be premises that are just given, and the 3rd is a conclusion which we derived from the 2 given premises. A proposition declares something to be or not to be the case is going to consist of a subject, a copula, which is a to-be verb, and a predicate. He doesn't talk about this yet, but you can mention, for example, the middle term and the major term and the minor term. And the middle term does the heavy lifting in a categorical syllogism because it links together the major and minor terms of the conclusion. The major term is the predicate, the minor term is the subject. And the middle term, so to speak, links them together where we can declare something to be the case or not to be the case in that conclusion. The next question deals with the relationship between logic and language, and this is Jevons' view, which I think is roughly correct. Now, when we're constructing propositions, of course we're using language, but language is just an instrument to refer to thoughts, and these thoughts refer to objects. In Jevons' view, there's no reason to doubt that our minds have access to the world around us. We treat objects as they are as long as we correctly think. What are the three acts of the mind considered in logic? So first there's simple apprehension, then there's judgment, and then there's reasoning or discourse. Simple apprehension is when we form an idea of something. Judgment compares ideas with each other, so to speak, with their agreement or disagreement with each other. It's the basis for creating propositions with a subject and predicate. And finally, there's reasoning or discourse, and that's when we have a syllogism, when we have premises deriving conclusions. We do this, so to speak, in the mind. The conclusion is derived in an armchair way, in a certain sense. It's using pure reasoning or pure logic. It's not an empirical thing, at least in that sense. When we have these given premises, then we try to pull out of them new things. The next question deals with what a general notion or idea or concept is. Notice that apprehension means we're absorbing something intellectually. We're taking on the form, so to speak, of an object. There's a merging between object and mind via an idea. An idea is a means to reach something. When you or I possess an idea of a triangle, we both possess the object. This idea is formal in the sense that it's based on an abstraction. It's not a particular triangle in my mind or your mind. It's a general notion instead. The general notion of Euclidean triangle applies to all possible particular triangles that are Euclidean. The abstraction, the idea, positively retains what all Euclidean triangles are in essence, what they have in common, while leaving behind features that are only true of particular Euclidean triangles. The last two questions I'm going to deal with in reverse order. So we're going to get into how do the nominalists, realists, and conceptualists differ in their opinion as to the nature of a general notion, and I want to kind of go beyond what Jevons has to offer here. But the last question is kind of interesting because you don't see this in other traditional logic textbooks. Like, what is the supposed fourth part of logic? And this is a little bit different, to be sure, than others. And Jevons here mentions or talks about method. It's about the arrangement of parts of a composition. And if we flip to lesson 24 in this book, so this is where he expands on this. So it's near the end of the book on method, analysis, and synthesis. And if we step back more, we're really thinking about the method of discovery of new facts. We find apparent facts to the senses, then with the method of discovery, we attempt to find universal laws of nature. We engage in analysis when we break things down conceptually, and we engage in synthesis when we combine things together conceptually. And there are certain general rules that apply to when finding or discovering things. So, for example, at least in general as a rule, nothing should be wanting or redundant. The separate parts should agree with each other. Nothing should be treated unless it is suitable to the subject or purpose. The separate parts, should be connected by suitable transitions and so forth. And this is where he continues to get into that. He also gets into what exactly is analysis and synthesis. Question number 4 in my mind is by far the most interesting because here we're diving into the philosophy of logic, in a way at least, but also more precisely into epistemology and especially metaphysics. And the question is, how do the nominalists, realists, and conceptualists differ in their opinions as to the nature of a general notion? Now, basically, remember that a general notion is an idea about a group of things. For example, the general notion of dog or man or gold. Now, nominalists claim that a general notion is only a common name we assign to things that we perceive as common. It's just a tag we assign, and that's it. The realists claim something much stronger than that. It's not just that we assign a common name to something or some group of things. It's that there really is a common characteristic among these group of things. There are common properties in order to say that they all belong to the same general notion. It's not a mere convention, but a truth about things that they fall under a general notion. And this seems to me a far more realistic view of things, so to speak. There really is something common about gold, for example, that we can call various things gold. They have a truly common nature. It has an atomic number of 79 and so forth. But we can't forget about the so-called conceptualists. And the conceptualists basically take a position that a general notion is knowledge, but it's knowledge in the mind of what we think things are. There's a resemblance, we think, between the things, and that's all. It's in the mind, but not necessarily in actual reality external to the mind. But I think that this is probably not a correct position to take. And we're going to do the following. I have a few books I want to reference right now. There's, in fact, a lot of books I can reference on the debate between conceptualists, realists, and nominalists. For example, even Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft, or the really, really good book, Principles of Logic by George Hayward Joyce, which is one of my favorite books on logic of all time. But I want to reference something much more offbeat, which is more about the question of God's existence. And that's, on the one hand, Edward Feser's book, The Last Superstition, and also his book, The 5 proofs for the existence of God, and I'm going to reference him when it comes to defending a realist perspective. We're going to consider the one over many argument, the argument from geometry, the argument from mathematics in general, the argument from the nature of propositions, the argument from science, the vicious regress problem. But also, we're going to consider the words are universal to problem, the argument from the objectivity of concepts and knowledge, and the argument from the possibility of communication. Consider a circle, the general notion of a circle. It's not reducible to any particular singular circle. Rather, a circle is a universal notion, and is not dependent on the human mind. Once we have a definition of what a circle is, we can then deduce all sorts of things about it, and that's not going to be identical to any particular material thing. And the concept as such is going to be immaterial. Consider that the series of numbers, which is infinite, is not identical to any particular material thing or things. If the universe is appeared tomorrow, 1 plus 1 equals 2 would still be true in base 10. The human mind can only store a finite amount of information, but mathematics, the truths of mathematics, are infinite. Or to briefly consider the nature of propositions, a proposition is not identical to something material or mental. Some propositions are necessarily true, like 1 plus 1 equals 2. Other propositions are contingent. My birthday is contingent. It is what it is. But even if every human died out, that proposition would remain true, that my birthday is such and such date. Consider the nature of science is to discover objective facts about the world around us, in part, right? And these objective facts are mind-independent facts that are just discovered. But if that is the case, and it is, it seems indeed to point to a realist position. We're uncovering laws of nature. We're uncovering how things like an electron behave. And electrons have an objective nature that's common to all electrons as electrons, or the nature of gravity as gravity. If it's gravity of the planet Earth or the gravity of the planet Mars, it doesn't matter. We're talking about objective things that share common natures. Someone might instead argue that we only have something like resemblance. It's not that there's a universal nature with multiple things sharing in that nature, such that we can classify those things with a general term. They just happen to resemble each other, and that's it. But the problem is resemblance itself is a universal. And this is something, for example, that Bertrand Russell pointed out. Now, if the nominalist kicks this problem up a level and claims that a group of things resemble each other without telling us how they resemble each other, we then have a higher order resemblance, which itself is a universal, and so forth. In any case, there's a problem with nominalism. What is it precisely that allows you or me to say that all these things are green, for example? The clear answer is that they share something in common. And once we acknowledge that, we're going to have to affirm in universal. Nominalist claims that we have the term green, but not the universal greenness. Yet the problem with this claim is that the reason you or I can use the word green is because that word can be applied to many things that are green by sharing in the nature of being green. Each utterance of the word, as a token, is of the same word type. However, if when you or I use the word green without it pointing to the same type of thing, then it would be impossible for us to communicate at all. Without being able to use the same word to mean the same thing, no communication is possible. And if we think resemblance is sufficient to make communication possible, we're back at the vicious regress problem. A broad argument here has been that we can talk to each other because we're not locked into private minds that are cut off from things. You can tell me water at 50 degrees Celsius is in liquid form. I understand that because my idea of water and liquid form, etc., is not totally cut off from your own understanding. We have access to something that is mind-independent with shared natures. So obviously my primary reference here is the great Thomist philosopher Edward Feser. I have referenced in passing the atheist Bertrand Russell. He has a great book called The Problems of Philosophy, which I highly recommend reading. And I think the realist position has a lot going for it when we're thinking about epistemology and metaphysics and philosophy of logic. I am the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is somewhat of an experimental video in terms of me moving around and filming myself and so forth. But if you enjoyed this type of material, leave a comment below and tell me. I would appreciate it. I want to expand this YouTube channel and my website and embark on some new projects. We did finish the Soups and Hill textbook, which was quite an accomplishment. There's like 50 videos on that, so that's pretty cool. But thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate your viewership, and I hope you enjoy this stuff and find it of value. And I would like to meet like-minded people who are interested in these topics, at least virtually. In any case, thanks for watching. Be well, and good luck to you. God bless.